the Buddha can't save you, and there are many Buddhas actually, the Buddhas, the many Buddhas, the infinite number of Buddhas and the infinite multiverse, they can't save you. You have to save yourself. And in order to do that, you have to analyze the nature of reality in order to save yourself.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I continue my exploration of consciousness, exploring a field of inquiry that is focused almost exclusively on consciousness and awareness for hundreds of years. Although it is not science, Buddhism has a uniquely close relation with physics and physicists being oft quoted. Books that come to mind are the Tao of Physics or the Dancing Wu Li Masters, which explore the parallels between quantum physics and Buddhist thought. I hope you enjoy this foray into the Buddhist mind. If you enjoy my content, please hit like on your podcast app. Please share with your friends. And if you'd like to join the conversation, look us up on Facebook at The Rational View. Dr. John Dunne serves on the faculty of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he holds the Distinguished Chair in Contemplative Humanities at the Center for Healthy Minds. He is also Distinguished Professor in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, where he currently serves as Department Chair. Dr. Dunne's work focuses on Buddhist philosophy and contemplative practice, especially in dialogue with cognitive science and psychology. His publications appear in venues ranging across both the humanities and the sciences, and they include works on Buddhist philosophy, contemplative practices, and their empirical examination and interpretation within scientific contexts. John Dunne speaks in both academic and public contexts, and he occasionally teaches for Buddhist communities, including the Gomdi Centers of Denmark and Australia, and Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe. In addition to serving as core faculty for the Center for Healthy Minds, he's a fellow of the Mind and Life Institute, where he has previously served on the board of directors. And he's an academic advisor to the Rangjung Yeshe Institute in Kathmandu, Nepal. Dr. Dunne, welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks, Al. Great to be here.
I appreciate you coming on. Could you tell me a little bit about your background? Are you actually a practicing Buddhist?
I am actually a practicing Buddhist. I started practicing Buddhism when I left, pretty soon after I left the United States Air Force Academy, where I first went after high school because I wanted to be an astronaut. And
oh, cool.
My students say, I kind of joke about, I think they think I'm still an astronaut. I just don't need a spaceship, But anyway, I then, back at that time, I was actually ended up at Amherst College, and I started studying with a fellow named Robert Thurman, who's now at Columbia University, better known as Uma Thurman's father. And he's actually a very well-known Buddhist scholar. And I just got hooked really in part because of issues around identity, because I was so invested in that kind of adolescent dream of, leaving the planet that when that fell apart, I really didn't know who I was, which is, I think, something I see a lot in my students these days as well. A lot of confusion about so many choices about who they are and how they should be. And it's really hard. Mm-hmm. So in any case, I then just kind of dove right into it and, finished my degree at Amherst, did a little kind of wandering about for a while, but then eventually ended up at graduate school at Harvard University. And all along this time, I continued to practice Buddhism primarily in Tibetan Buddhist traditions, though I have a connection with pretty much all the main Buddhist traditions these days. And I did my doctoral work on Buddhist epistemology before eventually landing here at the University of Wisconsin.
Now, was your original upbringing religious in any way, or a-religious, or how?
Yeah, I was raised a Catholic, pretty devout Catholic, although my mother was well, she used to refer to the previous pope as that bastard. So she had a certain she had a
A love-hate
yes.
relationship.
So yeah, she definitely was devout, but in her own way. And
Mhm.
but now, there was even talk at one point of me becoming a Catholic priest. So, being kind of religious was definitely part of my background.
Interesting. And but your original goal was to become an astronaut. So, that's much more of a sciency kind of approach to a calling. So did you see any conflict with those two approaches, or how did you feel about that?
Not really. I mean, not really, because in some ways, I think I just sort of the urge to transcendence, you might say, that's a feature of so many spiritual traditions that just kind of manifested in me as an urge to get the heck off the planet, and so in some ways it was really continuous, and there there are versions, of course, of Christianity, for example, that can really conflict with science, but there are other ways. And actually, the Catholic Church is interesting in this regard. It certainly has a long history of resisting scientific progress, but also it has a long history of serious engagement with science, to this day, actually. So it wasn't really something that at all presented to me as a conflict back when.
Okay, very, very cool. So, for those of us who are not that familiar with Buddhism, would you say is there a core inalienable doctrine or religious belief associated with Buddhism? Could you maybe give us a quick overview?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, one of the things about Buddhism that's helpful to know is that Buddhism, unlike especially when we think of Christianity in the modern time, we really emphasize the idea of what one believes, and that, you have to believe something in order to be a Christian.
Hmm.
Uh, but a lot of Buddhism is actually really, instead of, so that's an orthodoxy, like you've got,
Yeah.
the docs, so to speak, right? The set of beliefs that you have to keep straight, ortho. But this is actually, in some ways, Buddhism
Hmm.
is more like an orthopraxy, which means that there are certain kinds of practices one should adhere to, but the beliefs can be really quite wide ranging. So, in a
Hmm.
sense, you can, what makes you kind of socially a member of the Buddhist community is what's called going for refuge, which basically sort of says, this is a spiritual path that I want to follow, a path whose goal is to relieve suffering, and I'm going to join other people and follow the advice of those who've preceded me to see if I can also achieve that goal. And
Hmm.
then whatever you believe after that is not doesn't technically make you a Buddhist or not a Buddhist, which is kind of interesting.
Hmm.
So, having said that, however, you could say one really particularly important theory in Buddhism is what's called the Noble's Four Truths, or sometimes you'll hear the Four Noble Truths.
Okay.
And they are first that there is suffering. Like, in other words, there's something fundamentally dissatisfactory about our experience, about our lives, that there's an origin of that suffering, a causal origin of that suffering, that the cessation of that suffering can be achieved and has been achieved by some, and that there's a method or a path in order to get there. So that's kind of the core. If you don't accept that, then you could be a Buddhist sort of socially, but you're not really going to be able to practice very effectively, because it's all about, implementing, understanding, and there's a lot of emphasis on kind of rational inquiry and analysis, understanding what the nature of existence is in order to understand how we are, what is causing our dissatisfaction, and then implementing methods to get past that.
This particular path is maybe the doctrine is that to be a
Well, you could
Buddhist,
say that, yeah, right. So there's, I mean, that whole package is, so there's going to be an analysis of what suffering really means, and then an analysis of the claims about an origin of suffering. And the fundamental origin is basically confusion. Like, we're confused about the nature of reality, and that's why we're suffering. And then
Hmm.
there is the concept of the cessation of suffering, which, kind of classically is referred to as nirvana. And then there's a method to get there. So all four of those will have, really quite extensive texts. I mean, there's really no Buddhist Bible. I guess in some ways, if you look at the Tibetan tradition, for example, the Buddhist Bible would consist of 108 texts that 108 volumes of about 800 pages each. So it's
Wow.
like, including things that contradict each other deliberately. Uh, so,
Okay. Okay.
yeah, because, you have some people need to hear one thing and other people need to hear another thing. So anyway, the basic idea is that there's a kind of process, and all elements of that process need to be understood. There's a process that produces, dissatisfaction, and there's also a process of reversing that.
Hmm. Now, the Dalai Lama has mentioned that a reliance on causality and empiricism are common philosophical principles shared by Buddhism and science. Would you agree with that observation?
Yes, I would. I've actually had the pleasure of spending a fair amount of time with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and was at a meeting. My first time I spent a lot of time with him was back in 2007 at his residence in exile in northern India in a place called Dharamsala, when we gathered a group of scientists to kind of have a response to his book called The Universe in a Single Atom, where he says this, makes this statement, although he'd probably made it before then too. And
Mm-hmm.
basically, yes. So there are different. One thing to remember is Buddhism is really variable and across different cultures and different traditions and so on. But there's definitely a set of core traditions that the Tibetans follow coming from India, which very strongly emphasize empiricism to the point that if so, there's a seventh century philosopher I've worked out on a lot named Dharmakirti, and basically, what he says is the Buddha's word actually never proves anything that you can't prove yourself. And if it attempts to prove something that is trans empirical, right, that is beyond empirical access, then you could use it psychologically to, in a sense, kind of motivate yourself or whatever. But it does not prove anything. It cannot prove the words of the Buddha can't prove the existence of some trans empirical entity.
Okay.
Uh, and all the important stuff, including that basic theory about suffering and the relief of suffering, all that can be proven empirically. So that's a very strong position because in this strand of Buddhism, and a big reason for that is the idea that really you can't, the Buddha can't save you. And there are many Buddhas actually. The Buddhas, the many Buddhas, the infinite number of Buddhas and the infinite multiverse, they can't save you. You have to save yourself. And in order to do
Mm.
that, you have to analyze the nature of reality in order to save yourself. And if you don't, without that understanding of the true nature of reality, you're just going to keep, spinning around on the merry-go-round, as they say, of
It's
the
very,
wheel of life.
so we have to be involved in this. We can't just believe in something and be saved. It's a very active philosophy.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and there are versions of this philosophy which are very interesting, which where the sort of final account is to say that no beliefs are ultimately true. In other words, you can have models of the world and they can be useful and effective, but there's no single ultimately true model.
Hmm.
That's kind of, the final account, the God's eye view of everything, the theory of everything. That is a delusion.
Well, that's an interesting philosophical standpoint. It's kind of there is no truth. We can't achieve a true understanding. I can see why we're all confused about reality.
Yes. And a final, true, ultimate. And one of the way of thinking about it is map is not territory. Like there's this story that Jorge Luis Borges wrote, a very short story. I can't remember the title of it, but basically it's about, the emperor wants a map made of the empire, and the map makers go and they make a map and they come back and he says, no, I want more detail. And they keep going. Then finally they make a map that is the size of the empire. In other words, and now it's not a map anymore. It's the territory, right? So maps always, when our theories about whatever, scientific theories, other kinds of theories, they're always maps of something. So the map can't be the territory. If it becomes the territory, it's not a map anymore.
Hmm.
So I think that's one way to think about it, is that maps are always just maps. They're not the territory.
Interesting. So you can't simplify reality to a few underlying postulates.
You can, but if you think the postulates are the reality, then you're mistaken. It's like the old Zen finger pointing to the moon. Don't think the finger is the moon.
Okay.
Of course, if you're a realist, an objective realist, have a lot. If one is very objectivist about mathematical entities, then those people won't agree with this position because they
Oh,
think then that the map is the reality, actually. But that sends us in a different direction. Basically, Buddhists are kind of anti-Platonic.
okay.
You know, Instead of thinking that the real thing is the ideal form or what have you, it's actually the stuff that you can, in fact, touch, see, sense, smell. That's the real stuff. And then the mental abstractions are just that. They're abstractions. They may be helpful, but they're not reality.
The subjective experience is the reality.
Well, no, the stuff that causes your perceptual content is the reality.
You mentioned that there's, let's say, 180 or 108 texts of Buddhist thought to go through.
Well, actually, there's 225 additional ones, but we won't go there.
Science evolves through, what I would say, empirical challenge and reproduction of experiments. Religion typically evolves through argument from authority. Is Buddhist doctrine static, or does it evolve? And if it evolves, how do new subjective findings become accepted doctrine? Is there an imprimatur on these documents?
So that's a really great question, Al. And so I would say that in principle, so again, following this particular strand of Buddhist thought that His Holiness the Dalai Lama likes to refer to as the Nalanda tradition. Nalanda was a really amazing monastic university established probably around the start of the Common Era in ancient India, in
Hmm.
what's in the modern state of Bihar, not too far from the place where the Buddha is said to have become enlightened. And so in that university, they certainly taught this type of material, and they would adhere to Dharmakirti's position that, verbal testimony doesn't add anything. It might help direct you to your empirical, to engage with something empirically, but verbal testimony doesn't in itself prove anything, including the word of the Buddha, right?
Hmm.
So that principle was not necessarily upheld by all Buddhists by any means. And even that intellectual tradition itself kind of struggled with and we even see this in science to a certain extent, right? And Thomas Kuhn, of course, talks about this in context of scientific revolutions. It's the sort of weight of what came before can be hard to overcome when there are received theories about the way things are, like neuroplasticity, for example. The
Mhm.
brain doesn't change after a certain point in life, just that, it's set. Uh, that turns out to have, that was, received dogma, but that turns out to be wrong. We now know. Likewise, the Buddhist traditions had positions that they upheld that have turned out to be wrong, but the process of correcting them, basically, the more authoritative the person who made those claims were, the harder it gets to revise them.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
right? So sometimes revision is easy because it's just some mildly well-known philosopher who is not so authoritative that you can't gainsay him or her. But in most cases, it's not that easy. So one way sometimes in Buddhism this is done is the introduction of texts that make new claims and that are even attributed to the Buddha. And traditionally they would just say, "Oh, this was spoken by the Buddha." But looking in from the outside, kind of academically, it looks like, oh, this is a way of introducing new ideas in later generations, including even the idea of what are called treasure texts. in Tibetan Buddhism, which essentially are texts that are implanted in the minds of people. And then these people reincarnate. And then after some centuries, there's a trigger and then the text is revealed. And this text is planted by someone who has a lot of authority, right? So that's one
Mm,
way of bringing new ideas into the tradition. You setting aside whether what the tradition's truth claims about the process are, just to see that as a method is quite interesting, where you can kind of have ongoing revelation. But His Holiness the Dalai Lama has also really tried to encourage a process which is just empirical investigation. And for example, the ancient Buddhist cosmology is really a flat Earth cosmology. Not surprising, since it dates from fourth century BC in
mhm,
its
mhm,
earliest form. And he has and no and the Tibetan Buddhists, and I think actually Bob Thurman, my former teacher, once described this, seeing that they saw that famous blue marble picture. He was in India at the time, and somebody got a hold of it, some Westerner, and showed it to a bunch of these very erudite Tibetan scholars. And it's clearly like the Earth is round. This is up, and they just sort of said, "Oh, okay." They didn't have a big deal about it. But His Holiness is really pushed to say, rather than just say, "Oh, okay, whatever," let's really revise our cosmology to be more
mm,
in line with what we know in terms of modern cosmology, coming
mhm,
from astronomy, astrophysics. And he's been moderately successful in trying to have these kinds of updates, but it's still not easy, frankly. So this is the one place I have written about this, where the quote unquote scientific aspects of Buddhism don't quite live up to that idea, because there's not revision historically has been very tough. It kind
yeah,
of
yeah.
stopped. It largely stopped about 1,000 years ago.
Okay, so much it's much more difficult now to add or change the texts because of this weight of authority.
Yes, exactly. The weight of authority really makes it tough. But I think we are actually in a period where that's starting again.
Mm,
I mean, Buddhism started in around 500 BC, and up until around the end of the first millennium, there's lots of revision, lots of things that are being reconsidered. But then, especially a lot of the empirical claims kind of don't get revised after that point, and it seems
mm,
like that's starting to happen.
interesting. Maybe getting to a new topic here, and this is something I've been looking at recently in my series of podcasts, is consciousness and awareness. And I know Buddhism is very tightly associated with our experience and our thinking and our consciousness and awareness. Could you summarize for us the kind of the Buddhist understanding of maybe the hard problem of consciousness or of consciousness and awareness itself? You've referenced a soul or a reincarnation, and maybe just give us an oversight of what the Buddhist position is on this.
Sure. I mean, there's actually no single Buddhist position. There are many different Buddhist positions, and I'll try to represent you a particular version of that comes out of the Tibetan traditions. Uh, and so, one thing that is important to understand um, is that for Buddhists, one of the ways in which we are confused, and the confusion causes suffering, is the belief that there is a single autonomous controlling self, like the one who's listening right now, the one that's thinking right now, the person who's breathing, the person who's choosing to nod their head, whatever, that there's such a person who is in control. And that, so then, the non Buddhist traditions in India would say that there is such a thing, and that's the thing that gets reincarnated, and they call that the Atman, which is a word for self, like capital S self, this kind of controlling, indivisible, autonomous, agentive self. The little guy, there's that old Woody Allen movie of the guy inside your brain, like running the show, But so that homunculus, that vision, is the target of a lot of Buddhist arguments to say that there's no such thing, that there's no center, there's nobody in control, nobody's in charge in there, There's no controlling part of the mind body system, like some little node in your brain that like is in charge of everything. And their model of consciousness is built around that account of what we call selflessness, right? Where that kind of self does not exist. Of course, you can say you have a self in a different way, but not in that sense, right? And that what part of what that means is that the model of consciousness is not built around the idea of there being a kind of center from which, like a central perspective that you're sort of looking out on the world. There is a perspective in our experience, right? A sense of like there's an out there and an in here, but that's not who you are. That, the person who's on this end of the tunnel of sight, so to speak, is not who you are. That's only a structural feature of your visual experience. Uh, so that moment, so that part of that account of consciousness has certain implications the way it's develops. And one of them is that consciousness is momentary. So unlike our usual conceptualization of the way we are as people, like, I'm the same person I was 5 minutes ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, that there's a sense, oh, like, John, my name refers to the same being somehow. The Buddhists would say, actually, no, not really. We can talk about, a stream, a causal stream. And in that sense, there's continuity, but that causal stream is constantly changing. So consciousness is actually a causal stream of experiences, one after the next, that are causally. So the previous moment of experience is causally conditioning the present moment of experience. It's being causally conditioned by also it's the environment and interactions with the environment. And so consciousness is just sort of flowing along in time in this way, in a complex causal process. And the goal of Buddhist practice is, in a sense, to that there are certain features of that causal process that are dysfunctional, and you want to straighten that out, basically.
Very interesting.
So,
Before you go on,
yeah,
this actually has an interesting parallel, and that concept has been picked up by physicists who've been investigating consciousness. You may have heard of Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, and they have a theory of quantum mind, and in their discussion of orchestrated objective reduction of the quantum wave function, they reference Buddhist text on momentary collections of mental phenomenon and what does they say? Distinct, unconnected, and impermanent moments that perish as soon as they arise. And they actually reference the Sarvastivadins,
yep,
which describes 6,480,000 moments in 24 hours
yeah,
of conscious stochastic. And some Chinese Buddhists suggest that one thought takes 20 milliseconds. So these actually represent frequencies of conscious experience in the order of 50 to 75 hertz, which interestingly correlates well with the gamma brainwave frequency associated with conscious awareness of between 30 to 90 hertz. So
yes.
I found that as an interesting coincidence.
It is interesting. And Evan Thompson wrote a little bit about some of the work that showed this, that attempted to show this in his book, Sleeping, Dreaming, Being. My friend Evan Thompson, the philosopher, and who also wrote a very interesting book called Why I Am Not a Buddhist, more recent publication. But I actually have written an article in Philosophy East and West, the journal, kind of critiquing a little bit this, because it's not really, even though we can kind of come up with those numbers, it's not that simple, and there are many different accounts. So there are enough different accounts that if we just dig enough, we'll find a version that we can kind of make sound like aligns with modern neuroscience. But yeah, I wouldn't, the Sarvastivada is just one version, and I wouldn't over emphasize that, but it seems to be a certain coincidence there. It's I think it's, one way of accounting for this is the idea that a mental moment is 1/64th of the snap of a finger. And it's like, so does that mean there's, like some monk in a cave in the Himalayas who's kind of the
64.
timekeeper, you know. Yeah, right.
Like, this is
Right,
empirical,
right.
right? How did you get there?
Yeah, yeah. So, it's a little, not to be disparaging, but, I just don't want to make it that seem quite that closely aligned. There's a lot we can learn from those kinds of Buddhist texts, including the Sarvastivada. And there's a new volume called The Mind, and it's volume 2 in Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics by Wisdom Publications. This is a volume that His Holiness the Dalai Lama, conceived and sponsored, and then brought a team of Tibetans together. It's a really interesting volume, and if you want to read more about some of those theories that are coming out of Sarvastivada and other traditions, I highly recommend that volume called The Mind. But basically, I think you could say that the intuition that is really valuable here is this notion that the consciousness is sort of a causal flux. That I think is very powerful, and also that consciousness is embedded in, is embodied and embedded, to use some terms that people sometimes talk about as the enactive perspective or 4E cognition. Embodied, embedded, extended, and enacted. And there are ways in which, even though the Buddhists were largely, but not entirely, and the strand that if we get to the end point here, I'll eventually talk about, there is a strand that becomes non-dual, meaning there's what's called substance dualism, right? So you've got like matter, and you've got material stuff and mind stuff, and they are totally different kinds of stuff. So you can't have minds if you don't have mind stuff. Mind's consciousness can't come from just matter, right? So that would be a substance dualism, as opposed to some kind of a non-dual view, which could be, well, it's all just matter, and mind somehow emerges, consciousness somehow is just either epiphenomenon or just some kind of phenomenon emerging from matter, or it's all mind. Everything is mind stuff. And, matter is just the way in which the mind stuff looks to us under certain conditions. But so there, early the Sarvastivadins were substance dualists, and many, many Buddhist philosophers were, at least as a matter of convenience, so to speak, substance dualist. I should say that Buddhist philosophy is complicated because Buddhist philosophers, like the one I mentioned, Dharmakirti, will speak at different levels of analysis. It's a little bit like they'll sort of use, classical physics to talk about some stuff, and then they'll jump to the quantum level under certain conditions in order to talk about other things. And so, there's the idea that there's just one account is, there isn't just one account. So they have different levels of analysis. But I guess the main thing here is to say that the insight that the Buddhists, in terms of causality, right, that the consciousness is causal, the additional insight there is that the only access we have to reality, quote unquote, is through consciousness. So that's a very important point, which is going back to the idea of models. We model reality. Reality is a model, basically. It's our model of trying to explain, like organize our experience. But what we're working with there is always experience, is always and experience, meaning consciousness. So the idea that you could sort of do science without consciousness, like, oh, we don't need consciousness to do science, is incoherent, because science is, a human activity, a way of trying to understand what's happening in the world. And all of that only happens within the context of consciousness. So part of what that means is, and this is something that with the strong kind of dualism that we find in modernity, which has slowly been collapsing in late modernity, but like Cartesian dualism, you can't, the idea that, there's a kind of, we're just going to come up with an objective account and in a sense, eliminate consciousness from the story is absurd, right? So actually understanding the nature of reality also requires understanding the nature of consciousness. If we don't understand that, it's like we're, looking through a telescope at the world, but we have no idea how a telescope works. We just ignore the fact that the telescope is there, as if what we're seeing is the reality itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that's unexplained in science. There's, I think there are certain aspects of science that are working towards consciousness. There's a lot of strong work being done in neurobiology and to elicit, what causes consciousness, what interrupts consciousness, what are the weird things that can happen with consciousness, and I'm trying to explore some of these. So it's definitely something that needs work and is a bit of an open field right now in terms of how does this arise, and you're right, is dualism correct, is everything consciousness? There's the panpsychism, the universe is consciousness, we don't have to explain the hard problem of consciousness because it is everything, versus the emergent people that everything is matter and consciousness is an epiphenomenon of processing in certain complex networks. And you know I'm at this point I'm somewhat agnostic to all of these. Does Buddhism say what's the right path? Is there some enlightenment from Buddha that tells us what's right?
I wish. uh, I mean, there are. So one thing I will say that's interesting, actually, is that the account of consciousness as a kind of causal process that's embedded in a context and that's always embodied. So minds, even the substance dualists among the Buddhists will always say you don't have minds without bodies. Minds are always embodied. And part of what that means is that minds are always involved in a kind of emergent process, actually, where they are the result of, and this would especially be the kind of philosophical strand that Dalai Lama talks about. They're always the result of the complex interaction of many different components. So the notion that what we think of as consciousness in our sort of ordinary waking experience can somehow be sort of extracted from its physical manifestation or extracted from the body, will just sort of fly free. That's just a delusion. Like it's always embedded. It's a complex, interdependent phenomenon. And one way of simply saying it is that to be real is to be interdependent. So, and there's no such thing as non-dependent entities on this particular account. So, uh, then when you think that you start to inquire into the idea of like panpsychism, for example, one way of saying that, and this would be like I've been working a little bit with Giulio Tononi, who's here. I don't know if you are familiar with him, but he has a well-known theory called integrated information theory. IIT is one of the theories about consciousness out there. And he says he's a panpsychist, but he, like Galen Strawson, also, I think, the philosopher, not too familiar with Galen's position, but I think well enough to say something about it here, is, that doesn't mean that everything is consciousness, actually, on their view. So that would be more like a kind of idealism where, as I was saying before, like you can say there's only one kind of stuff in the world, and that kind of stuff is mind or consciousness. But they would just say that consciousness is a is an integral feature of the stuff of the universe, but it's not the only kind of stuff. So, like Giulio Tononi would, as I understand him, would say even like every little particle of in your headphones is all that matter also has a certain level of consciousness, actually. But it's sort of confusing to call it consciousness. It's a lot of this is about how something can represent information or contain information. And it's a little confusing because, it's not consciousness in the way we think of consciousness. But in order to get to that point, the matter has to be arranged in a particular way. It's got to have certain types of connections that enable it to hold, in a sense, to represent, or maybe that's not the right term, but to hold more information. And he has a term called phi, which talks about how different kinds of networks can relate to each other in such a way that they hold more and more information. Uh, and so it's not just about like how many nodes you have, but it's actually the architecture of the network that's really important. And so then when you get to a certain point, you have the right kind of network, then something that looks like what we would think of as consciousness emerges from that. But it is not. Uh, it, so, in part, but part of the way that's happening is that there's always a kind of element of consciousness, even in the matter itself, that it's and it's even when it's not embedded inside of a network, but it's still material, right? So that's a very interesting position that I personally find kind of intriguing. It's not dissimilar to a very late Buddhist position that we find in Buddhist tantras, which is the kind of so tantric Buddhism develops at the end of the first millennium, and that's what goes on to Tibet. And very briefly, the version of that is that instead of being substance dualists, they say, well, everything is made out of the same kind of stuff. And the metaphor they have for it is in Sanskrit is vayu, in Tibetan is lung. It means wind, and it's really a metaphor for energy. So everything, even the stuff that looks like it's solid, is all made out of energy. And minds are energy kind of in certain patterns. That's what a mind is. That's what consciousness is.
Very correct from a physics standpoint, too.
Yeah, right. So it's a very interesting idea. But they don't kind of get in, obviously they're not going to be doing mathematics to talk about, how those networks operate or the mathematics of complex dynamical systems or what have you. But there are certain kinds of intuitions that are intriguing that do suggest certain roots. And one of those roots, by the way, is also then, what does it mean for us to be conscious? Like, what exactly do we mean from this? Remember, again, science is always done from the standpoint of consciousness. So then the question is, well, what does it mean to feel like you're conscious?
Yes.
What is that? And how do you know that you're conscious? I assume you're conscious. Are you conscious, Al? Or does that say Al or AI on the screen? I can't.
Well, no, I am Al.
You're not Max Headroom in another form.
Yeah, no, I mean, we have this subjective experience, and we believe that other people similar to us share this subjectivity, and we have this illusion of being a controller. You say that Buddhism says there is no controller, no volition, or I don't know if it means no volition.
Well,
I don't know what
there's
that
volition.
means.
There's volition. There are desires, there's motivations, and so on. But it's not like there's a kind of so, one way to think about this is even in terms of how contemporary neuroscience talks about brain function, there's no part of the brain that controls the rest of the brain. But, if you think of the brain itself as a complex dynamical network, then, and one that is self-organizing and able to respond to its environment, right, to maintain its autonomy, then, or, just to maintain its organization, then there isn't in that kind of a system, there's no controlling part of that system, but the system nevertheless is able to respond to different inputs.
I see.
It can motivate itself to, to move in a particular direction. For example, if we think of it like even a simple bacterium moving away from a noxious substance and moving up like a glucose gradient, that's a kind of system. There's no brain inside of that bacterium, but it's able to, as a system, it's able to interpret its environment and respond accordingly. So that's the basic kind of image also of human consciousness, that it's a complex, Buddhists wouldn't have this terminology, but the idea of a complex dynamical system is a good analogy for the way Buddhists are talking about consciousness.
I like all of this discussion about momentary consciousness and causal streams and complex interactions as consciousness, but it would seem that sort of philosophy would be totally inconsistent with reincarnation. How does Buddhism assume that? What is reincarnation in this case? What are we reincarnating?
Yeah, so reincarnation is there's a sort of remember like different levels of talking, different levels of analysis. So one simple level is, oh, Al, you were, I don't know, you were a great sitar player in your previous life, and we can kind of make up stories of who you were in all of your previous lives, kind of like the Shirley MacLaine version of reincarnation, and we identify you in different lifetimes and say, oh, you have this issue and that issue because I don't know, you practice sitar too hard, and now you get headaches and whatever it is, right? So we have we can have an idea that there's this person who's kind of flowing through time, but actually that's a folk level. Then you do find that in Buddhist texts and in Buddhist cultures, a kind of folk level of this idea of reincarnation.
Hmm.
But the more technical level for Buddhists would be that the you know the person like me, John Dunne, is not going to be reborn, because John Dunne is a name for consciousness in this particular kind of body. It's not just name for consciousness; it's a name for this embodied being in this time and place, and that's never going to happen again.
Sure.
So reincarnation isn't that there's a single person kind of flowing through time. One metaphor is if you take a candle and you have another candle, you light a candle and you've got another one nearby, and just as you're putting out the one, you let it light the other one. So is it the same flame or a different flame? Right? That's one traditional metaphor. And it's kind of like, well, it's like yes and no, right? There's continuity, but there's not identity. So the basic idea here is that there's a causal flow, and that causal flow continues. Now, at a trivial level, that we all know that that's already the case. We all agree with that because, for example, all of your podcasts are presumably going to be around, you know, after you're gone. Especially if
We can
we
hope.
set up an antenna and like, you know, maybe we should transmit them out into the cosmos, and like those radio waves, they'll maintain a certain amount of coherence for a while, and so it's all in the stuff of our bodies. It's not like it's just going to disappear. So we leave all kinds of traces that continue. We leave traces in each other, memories and thoughts, feelings. We leave, writings and recordings, impacts on our environment, on our societies, on our families. So there's all kinds of continuity already, and that's so part of it is really part of the like more sophisticated way of understanding reincarnation is thinking in terms of that kind of continuity, right? Uh, then on top of it, then no question, Buddhists are also going to assert that there is some kind of continuity of the stuff of consciousness itself, like in using that energy metaphor that they talk about, that there is some kind of energy that persists, and that energy is going to go on to then um, be manifested in another life. It's again not the same person, but it is there is a continuity of that energy, and obviously that part is very hard to establish empirically, pretty clearly. But that would be the notion that there's some kind of a continuity of the energy. And again, the idea that there's continuity for us, like genetic continuity, they talk about karma, we talk about genes and culture, all that stuff. In some ways, we already accept, but that we are the products of a particular kind of genetic heritage and cultural heritage, the products of a certain educational system, of our past experiences, and that there's a kind of causal flow, which is the expression of our manifestation as beings in the world. But then the question, what happens after death, is saying that there's some kind of, I don't know, quantum packet of energy that continues. That gets a little harder to just make sense of from an
Mm.
empirical standpoint. Although we are doing research on a very peculiar phenomenon, is on a phenomenon called tukdam, which is a when practitioners engage in certain kinds of meditation, uh, the goal is to maintain awareness into the death process. And then what we see is, I mean, this part is the case that there are people who are clinically dead, but they don't go into rigor mortis. They don't exhibit, a normal rate of decomposition, or really even any decomposition for some days. And they look like they don't look dead, frankly. And
Hmm.
they will remain like that sometimes for, you know, 2, 3 weeks, often shorter. And these cases are documented. But we've been trying to, we've done the only paper we've published so far on this is a negative finding, which is basically, given the, technology we have and the conditions in the field, we have no evidence of any brain function occurring, even at a very subtle level, at least nothing that we can measure.
Well, it's good that you're investigating this empirically. That's, I think, it may be why Buddhism resonates with a lot of scientists and physicists, especially. I've seen several authors in physics papers and books have pointed out parallels between Buddhist thought and our understanding of modern physics. And the things that I was talking to you about Penrose previously, and thought that there's also, I've read the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness, the idea that nothing has an intrinsic nature, aligns well with quantum physics, the idea that basic particles don't have physical trajectories. We've experimented on them. If you're not observing them, they don't really exist, and they can switch forms seemingly at random between, as long as the energy is conserved, their form is uncertain until they're observed. So it's quite interesting that there are some of these parallels, and I think that's the fact that you don't have to have a belief is probably resonates well with a scientific mindset of skepticism. So
Yeah,
I think.
I'd say that. I mean, one of the great examples of that recently is Carlo Rovelli's book, Helgoland. I don't know if you've seen that book, but there he talks a lot about a particular Buddhist philosopher, Nagarjuna. Yeah, I highly recommend that book. We just had a conference actually at Berkeley, organized by Bob Scharf, professor at Berkeley of Buddhism, and we just had a sort of, I forget exactly what it was called, but it was sort of Quantum Physics and Buddhism 2.0. And we had Chris Fuchs there, who's the one of the real, founders of the Cubism interpretation. And then Carlo Rovelli was there, is who has this relative, I forget, for some reason, of relational interpretation. I think that's what he calls it. And he's, the way he put it was, um, you know, he developed this interpretation, which I'll describe in a moment. And then, people kept saying to him, "Have you read Nagarjuna? Have you?" And he said, "Who the hell is that?" Nagarjuna, Nagarjuna. And then he finally discovers Nagarjuna is, this Buddhist philosopher, and he finally sits down to read it, and he couldn't believe it, actually, how much alignment there was for his philosophy, or how motivated, in a sense, it made him to work out certain issues. And so he talks about this in Helgoland, and which is a great book. And the crux of this interpretation, and the place where Nagarjuna, in a sense, makes a contribution, is Nagarjuna, in his very famous text in Sanskrit called the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, which means the fundamental verses on the middle way. He says, Yaha Pratitya Samutparam Shunyatam Tam Prachakshmehe, which means, in Sanskrit, which means that which is, we say that which is interdependent is empty. So, and in short, there's no such thing as something that is not empty. In other words, to be real, to exist, to be able to say that something is existent, to make sense of that term, of that model, right? Say, oh, this exists. The only way we can make sense of that is if that thing is not existing in and of itself, in a sense, in isolation. That the only way things that can exist is in relation to each other. The only way they can have identities is in relation to each other. And so Ravelli takes that idea. And so when we say they're empty, what we mean is they're empty of any kind of fixed, absolute, non relational identity. And it's the only kind of identity they have is an interdependent identity. And so Carlo took that idea and, in his account, the, as you said, like uh, it's only when the quantum effect is observed, when a quantum level of phenomena is observed, that then it has a fixed identity. Otherwise, it's in a superposition, for example. Is Schrodinger's cat dead or alive? Or Carlo redefines it. He said, I don't like killing cats. So he says, is he awake? It's a sleeping draft instead of a sleeping gas instead of a poison. Is the cat awake or asleep? And the idea here is that, well, we can, one solution, I don't know if I fully understand, and to the extent I understand it, whether I fully accept this solution, but one solution to this is simply to say that all things are already in relation to each other. Not all things, but things are already in relation to each other. So within those networks of relations, they have identities. But the question is, which network? So from the standpoint of one network, a thing can have a fixed identity, but because it's not in relation to another network, it seems to lack that kind of a fixed identity. So no thing has a fixed identity outside of a network, but within a network, it has an identity, right? It has it's not in a superposition, but it is, but those networks are not necessarily in relation to each other. So even inanimate things can be in relation to each other. Inanimate things, and so Carlo's really concerned with, in a sense, a kind of the threat of idealism, if you like. Saying giving too much credence to the role of the observer, and so instead of just like, it's not just about an observer; it's about just being in relation, and the observer plays a role in the sense that when the observer is part of the network that it determines or that permits that identity to be manifest. I think it's a very interesting way of riffing off of Nagarjuna, and it's certainly an interpretation that many people are finding compelling. I had a little, to the extent I understand it. For me, part of it is I think there's too much concern about the threat of idealism. Because again, maybe a rock can be in relation to other rocks, and the quantum level of phenomena were in question are determined in relation to the other things they are related to in a network. But quantum physics is done by humans in human minds, and so the model of quantum physics and the collapse of the wave function doesn't really seem to me to make a lot of sense if we're not talking about human minds as part of that network.
Yeah, you definitely have to have a model of the observer in your description of an experiment, and that's something that's been pointed out.
So I'm sure I'm mangling Carlo Rovelli's position. So I just encourage you to have a look at Helgoland and make
Yeah,
sense of it yourself. But also Chris Fuchs's, this is what I like about Cubism, is that it doesn't just try to sort of eliminate the role of human consciousness without turning it into some kind of a magical, solution to the problems of quantum physics.
This has been very interesting. I've learned quite a bit in this discussion, and I think we're getting towards the end of our time slot here. So I'd like to thank you for coming on and enlightening us towards the Buddhist way. I'm going to send you a T-shirt for the Rational View for coming on. So
thanks.
to express my appreciation of your time. And before I sign off, there's one question I ask a lot of my contributors. What science fiction are you interested in? Are you a reader of science fiction?
Yes, I'm quite a bit of a fan. Let's see. I liked. Well, I just finally finished watching The Expanse. I'd read the books. So, and my friend, I don't know if you know Adam Frank, the astrophysicist, but
No, I don't.
he really encouraged me to. He's a very interesting fellow. He does some blogging. He's worked for NPR, the New York Times, and stuff. Very interesting guy, and so he encouraged me in The Expanse, which I really enjoyed. I liked Andy Weir's, The Martian, of course, but then there was this new one that I really enjoyed, and I can't remember the name of it right now. About I don't want to do a spoiler. So Andy Weir's book about encountering aliens. I'll just say that much. I wish I
Okay.
could
Okay.
remember the title. That was one I just read recently, and I've been working through some of Ted Chiang's his stories also. So yeah, bit of I'm go
Very
way
cool.
back in sci-fi. And
Very
that was
neat.
certainly part of the reason I wanted to be an astronaut, right? I was kind of a Trekkie and all that stuff, and so there you
Sure.
go.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
All right, take care, Al. See you later. Bye bye now.
Bye bye.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.